Good afternoon, colleagues. Can we settle down so that we can start? My name is Maisela Kekana. I'm your facilitator for today. As you know, there are four breakout groups today, and I believe yesterday we were all in the plenary setting in Chamber Hall. So on the first day, you were all requested to signal your interest in joining the breakout group discussions through a link that was shared in the room yesterday. The link was also published on the webpage of the Glasgow Dialogue event. But just to explain that the sign-up sheet was just intended as a facilitative tool to aid the logistics. But participants who have not signed up are still welcome to join the breakout group of their choice. I'm sure we all know that this is a party-driven process, so other people can still join, registered or not. The intended aim of the breakout groups is to facilitate a more interactive discussions, as it was explained yesterday, and to ensure inclusivity and transparency. The discussions of the breakout rooms can be joined by all SB 56 registered participants, as I've already explained, and also through the platform. As you know, there's a platform for the registered delegates, so they can join online. And just to inform you that the breakout groups will be broadcast live as well. In front of us, we have exact same questions that were flighted on the screen yesterday. Because we are a small group, I believe we can take them one by one so that we can capture your views clearly. You are not limited to these four questions, but they are intended to structure our discussions so that I can get good notes of the discussions. If we see that we are taking too much time, we might move on to the next question, but you can still, in your intervention, address the previous question if you had not had a chance. The SBI chair has encouraged us to encourage you not to use speaking or speeches, but to have a dialogue. So this is a dialogue. Let's try to make it as interactive as possible, and avoid reading long statements. So I'll try my best to facilitate the discussions so that it can be interactive. Feel free to ask each other questions if you did not understand or you need clarity on the intervention made. I think that way we will all leave this room knowing exactly what the nature of the discussions were, and having a better understanding of each other. Shall we start, or is there any other question to how we are going to proceed. If not, we will go into the first question. And for those that do not have flags, we are going to ask you to introduce yourself before you speak, so that we can capture exactly your intervention under the correct organization and so forth. So the first question, as you have in front of you, it reads like this. What are the arrangements for the funding of activities to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage associated with the adverse impacts of climate change? So that is the first question. We'll need somebody to break the ice on this one. I know it's always not so easy, but I'm going to stop talking now and allow you to address this particular question. With me, I've got the Secretariat. They will help me to take proper notes because I really have to try and capture the discussions as they unfold. I see Palau, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just can you repeat that question, or can the question be posted on the screen behind you, or repeat the question slowly so I could write it down? I'm sorry.
Thank you for that. The question, I'll read slowly. It reads, what are the arrangements for the funding of activities to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage associated with the adverse impacts of climate change? So it's all about arrangements for the funding of activities in those three areas to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. We want to listen to you on this particular question and get your understanding collectively. So, as I said, I'm going to stop talking and allow you to go straight into it. Somebody to break the ice. My compatriot, South Africa, you have the floor, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcella, and hello everyone. My name is Ernesta, and I'm from South Africa. And perhaps this is a controversial point, and since I'm a lawyer and we like details, and to break the ice, I want to ask the question about this question in the sense that, I mean, technically we can say currently there aren't any arrangements to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. But we look at this question in the light from what other sources are there that we can tap into, but technically there isn't actually anything yet. When we ask this question, we look at the existing arrangement and what are the existing sources that we kind of rely on, but nothing has really been designated. So that's my probing remark towards the framing of the question. Thank you.
All right, let's hear from others, and as you do that, perhaps you can also respond to the remarks by South Africa. I see Chile, you have the floor.
Thank you, facilitator, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm Gladys from Chile. I was thinking the same thing as my colleague here, Nesta from South Africa, because under the name of arrangements, there are no specific arrangement or dedicated arrangement under the convention for loss and damage. Although we recognize there are funding or facilities that cover adaptation that could be seen as minimizing loss and damage, but under the name of arrangements, they are not. So we see that as a need, and that's why we are talking about of funding for loss and damage specifically. And we see funding also outside of the UNFCCC, support for disaster risk management. But again, it's not under the title of loss and damage arrangements for addressing, minimizing, and averting. Thank you.
So if I understand Chile correctly, your point is that under the convention we do not have any sort of arrangements, but outside the convention there could be something?
No, I think they are not with the title of loss and damage. Not outside nor inside. But there are funding there that can be seen as funds for some of them addressing and under the convention for averting and minimizing, as we heard yesterday to the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund in their presentations. We can see that they have funded activities for averting and minimizing, but not loss and damage itself, you know.
Thanks, Chile, for clarifying that. We'll need some reactions or even different remarks. The floor is still open on this first question. I see Palau followed by Vanuatu, but let's start with Palau.
Thank you, co-facilitator, and good afternoon, colleagues. I'd like to raise two things. First, in relation to the question, I'm kind of in the same line with South Africa. I think it's the arrangement of the question. But I do know several years ago in the Pacific region, there were some discussions about looking at an insurance. And it's not necessarily loss and damage, but it's for these events of typhoon and infrastructure related, so forth. But in the case study that they found, it was that the premiums for small islands, especially given our vulnerability, especially low lying and that our isolation and our economics and capacity, the premium was very high. So some countries were still thinking about, but that's the only arrangement and that I'm aware of that Palau was looking into. But other than that, we have really no arrangements to fund loss and damage with our own national coffer, because in taking that into light, then you have to look at funding for education, health, those takes other priorities. And so this loss and damage issue is an issue that's dear to the Pacific, and especially for Palau, because we experienced a typhoon, one of our small atoll communities, where it nearly wiped out most of the homes. And in fact, to this day, people have not gone back and resettled there because the basic infrastructure, the water lens were compromised. The food source, the taro that which they rely on as their staple, the whole taro patch, it was destroyed by salt water. And so there are a few people living there, but it's because they want to live there. But in terms of the community going back 100%, they're still actually living on the main island. But Chair, I want to just, yesterday's discussion, a reflection that I would like to touch on, just a reflection that, especially coming from the SIDS, you know, it was very interesting to hear the WMO and IOM presentations. WMO has is a very useful supporting mechanism for enhancing early warning systems in SIDS and LDCs, the crews that they mentioned, and a worthwhile program on improving availability of science for climate action. IOM has been supporting work to better manage internal relocation, but these are not exactly getting at the loss and damage issue. Early warning may assist populations to be better prepared and may save more lives, but if there is a devastation that is but if there is a devastation, this is a scant comfort. Better science is also needed for project development. but doesn't itself lead to funding. Internal relocation is the result of climate change impacts, but does not address the loss and damage incurred. And that in itself kind of reflects to what I'm saying when you talk about having an internal arrangements, funding mechanism for loss and damage for small islands. I can speak for Palau, we don't have one. But we do need one outside to help support us because the typhoons that I mentioned actually kind of demonstrate how vital IOM and WMO, but it does not really address the loss and damage issue. Thank you.
I think that was quite clear, Palau, and I take your point on the usefulness of a proper early warning system, that it can save some lives, and some form of arrangements for dealing with internal displacement. But as you say, this is not something that exists in Palau. We need more. We need something that will address the actual loss that arise from some of these activities. But yes, you can clarify.
I'm sorry, but just to give you the timeline, this typhoon happened while we were in Warsaw. It was Haiyan. So imagine from Warsaw up to now, those communities have not been able to go back to their homeland. We have elderlies back home that in Koror that still crying want to go back, but because there's no health services, the dispensary was destroyed. We cannot allow them to go back because if they do go out there and they need medical services, it's going to cost us more money at the national government to send a boat out to get them back into Koror because they actually live far away that you have to take a boat out there or a plane. Thank you.
I fully understand you. We were also recently hit by floods in my own country, I think about 2 months ago, and the communities have not been able to go back home. Well, in our case, they don't have home to go to. It's completely destroyed by the flooding that happened. But I go to Vanuatu.
Thank you very much, facilitators. I would like to speak in support of the statements that there really is no mechanism for us to access finance to address loss and damage. I want to, first of all, request that this is documented, and you've stated that. And for us, it's very important that this documentation leads to a decision space, or at least an agenda item where we can have these discussions that lead to an outcome. And for us, that outcome would be a facility, a finance facility for loss and damage. Building on the discussions yesterday and the presentations yesterday, we heard from the GCF about the options for finance to be accessed which may speak to or be relevant to loss and damage. And I'd like to give a real example from Vanuatu. We currently have, for us, a major Green Climate Fund program on climate information services. And this program is outstanding in that it brings some of the best available science in the world to help us make decisions in our sectors to get ready and be able to think about reducing risks on climate change. So for example, our agriculture sector, our energy sector, our water sector now have science that allows them to make decisions to reduce risks. What happens, however, when a major event occurs is that we lose all of that risk reduction planning. So our agriculture sector has taken the best science to put in climate resilient crops. One extreme event will wipe out all of that risk reduction thinking. The best available science for ocean acidification, for example, tells us that our reefs are being lost or will be lost at a certain time. And then the loss occurs. So all of that science almost becomes irrelevant. That's just the GCF example. The two indicators that the GCF mentioned yesterday in their presentation that are relevant to loss and damage, This is in their integrated result management framework. The first was loss of life, and we very much acknowledge that important indicator relevant to loss and damage. The second was loss of economic assets. Again, very important. But what's missing in those two indicators would be indicators relevant to some of the other non-economic losses and damages. For example, the loss of our cultural assets, the loss of our traditional identity, the loss of coral reefs for food security that are not necessarily economic assets. So these are some of the gaps that we see within the existing structures, finance structures of the UNFCCC. So big gaps for some of those non-economic losses and damages. In the Adaptation Fund, we heard very clearly that there is no window, no mechanism for loss and damage. There's no mandate for the Adaptation Fund. So that's very clear. We also heard from some partners, the World Bank and others, that there are insurance mechanisms, parametric insurance mechanisms that can respond to events. The problem with slow onset events is that there's no trigger. So as sea level rises day after day, month after month, year after year, there is no trigger to get those parametric insurance. The parameters have not been reached. There's no high wind speed or substantial rainfall, and so we miss out on those insurance mechanisms. And so just some examples coming from yesterday, again highlighting the gap that there is no financial mechanism or financial flows for some of these slow onset events or non-economic losses and damages which are experiencing right now in the Pacific and undermining human rights. Thanks.
I think that was a very useful intervention because it indicate that there's still things that are missing, including both from the insurance side and from the funders side. But I will let the other parties react to that. For me, that was quite interesting. And I have the US. Is it the US? Okay, they were online, so we will go back to the room. And I see the Sudan, yes.
Thank you so much. And I would like to echo first with colleagues that there are no funding arrangement available for loss and damage. However, I would like to start with the sense and the IBCC because the sense is now become clearer about the urgency issue and about my colleagues just before me talked about the slow onset event, and I'm going to talk about extreme events because the IBCC and the sense from, for example, that dedicated to the African continent is also clear about the increase of severity and frequency of extreme event. And for a continent like Africa, that is really devastating because of the high dependency on vulnerable livelihoods and vulnerable assets. So even we are not yet there, I mean about medium and long-term climate change impact on loss and damage, and yet we are challenged and burdened with how to deal with loss and damage. I mean, at this stage, I guess countries are really challenged. I think the discussion of the question on challenge will be easier than this one because here we do have very little to talk about. However, I guess in this space we could talk about if you consider 1.5 will affect more than 25% of land in Africa, and with 2 degrees centigrade, 45% of land in Africa will be affected, and that would mostly will be loss and damage. So the issue, like I said, the issue of urgency and speed responses, because, for example, of increase of drought and flood intensity and frequency. So it's just interesting because the IBC is talking about for the event that used to happen once every 10 years, then they are expected with increase of warming that the intensity and severity will increase. But even now, many of the countries in our region are talking about the increase of frequency even within the same season. So, like in South Africa, after loss of life in a severe flood, after just 3 weeks, again people face outstanding flood event. So now, and the same is in many countries. 2020 for Sudan was unforgettable year because there was mass flood in everywhere, and now, for example, we are dealing with flood every year. We used to have a frequency of flood in certain areas every 10 years, every 40 years, but now every other year we would have flood. So I guess the issues about the responses, most of them are led by countries. The development money is being diverted away from very essential things like health, like education, because loss and damage, addressing loss and damage is prioritized over anything else. So I guess this is the current situation, how countries are doing this, and I spent the whole morning talking to African countries representative. I even talked to Sudan, as if I'm not from there. And my colleague from Sudan was telling me that we are still not fully recovered from the drought of 80s, Sahelian drought, because people moved from the rural areas and settled in shanty areas around Khartoum, and some of them they got permanent settlement. However, this is in terms of agriculture, in terms of many things, this is a great loss. But however, I mean, if you look at the even the issues of insurance and weather-based index insurance, this in many countries are at experimental stage still. And even for those who where the private sector develop those, you will find that the issue of accessibility of countries is another issue, because countries they can't afford to get that. So I guess, and the other thing is, in one event you will find yourself in a position, you might not be in a position to address, but you will face the challenge of addressing the different range of losses and damages, economic and non-economic, and loss of life, and physiological stress, and all the long list. So some countries, one of the African countries was telling me that they were paying some NGOs in order to, the way they are doing it, they are diverting some money from their national budget, allocating it to national or international NGO, because they have the experience to deal with loss and damage. And they are dealing that with offices of disaster and emergency, and most that in that country the office is placed under the prime minister. So I guess the issue is quite challenging, but I would like to underline what I started with, is the fact that there is nothing existing related to funding loss and damage in our countries. I would like to stop here.
Thank you, Sumaya, for that detailed interventions. I'm sure your colleagues are also listening. They would probably react to the interventions, but your points are quite clear. The science, there's no question about what science is saying around loss and damage, and that came out quite clearly in the sixth assessment report in the working group 2, which was presented to all of us, including yesterday. So the science indeed is quite clear, and the question really is what sort of arrangements do we have. I take your point that many of the insurance schemes are still at an experimental stage, and the colleague also touched on that earlier on. But Let me get the EU to put their point across and also react to what has been said so far. From there, we go to the Philippines, but EU first.
Thanks, facilitator. Actually, I believe that Fiji has had their flag raised for quite some time, so I'll pass first to Fiji, if that's okay.
Thank you. Indeed, we go to Fiji. Fiji. Apologies, Fiji.
That's okay. That's no problem. I think it's just that we're in the same line.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's very kind. I would like to echo the sentiment that's been expressed in the room about the limitations to existing climate finance, but I just want to map them in a little bit of detail. And although many of us are already very expert in loss and damage arrangements, I just want to start by articulating some of those very important issues from a Pacific perspective. Obviously, we're facing more extreme weather patterns, and with those come an increasing array of climate-induced disasters with a very long lag time. And what is happening as a consequence is that we have villages, we have communities and towns that have barely recovered from one set of disaster events and rebuilding that are then being hit again, particularly by cyclones. On top of that, we're facing large-scale relocation and resettlement issues, and Fiji has been very innovative in this space, but are seeking loss and damage funding beyond what is currently on the table. There are very many complex ecosystem sets of implications attached to loss and damage issues. We have, across the Pacific region, the issue of relocation of tuna fisheries that our SPREP lead was speaking about last night, that is potentially economically devastating at a regional level. And all of these, then, we turn to look at what existing climate finance delivers our region. So our experience, for example, with the Green Climate Fund, which is what many of the parties in the room suggest that we look to when it comes to loss and damage, is this. From a Fiji perspective, we have been working now at accreditation for 5 years, and we are hopeful of being successful. But it's been a long 5-year journey. There are many smaller Pacific islands for whom the administrative burden of accreditation is too great. On average, the approval process for projects is 12 to 22 months for project development and 24 months for project approval. It's a very long project lag time. And you have to show climate relevance of projects through scientific studies at a local level. We don't often have the available science. There's a huge requirement of technical knowledge to be brought into countries often. Adaptation funds require adaptation-based mandates, and what we've been often talking about is loss and damage. It's a whole different set of issues. It's beyond adaptation. We're looking at financing that's a very different stream. So then we've got the Global Environment Facility, chronically underfunded, access is restricted and used for mitigation. Locally, we have a whole set of regional risk transfer mechanisms. We've got insurance-based mechanisms, but the core issues at a Fiji level and at a Pacific level are issues that are beyond even the realm of existing finance and insurance products. We're looking at slow onset events. We're looking at events that simply do not have finance products available at the moment. You've heard my colleague from Vanuatu talk about parametric insurance models. Again, Fiji is innovating in this area. And yet, what do you do about sea level rise? What do you do about large-scale relocation and resettlement issues? I mean, these are simply beyond the scope of existing finance products that are available. So instead, we have been asking for a dialogue. We have been asking for you to engage with us in a process to think about a loss and damage finance facility. We need you to innovate alongside us. We need to work together to solve these issues. This is genuinely beyond the realm of existing climate finance products. I can't emphasize that enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiji, for making those points passionately so, but also for highlighting your experiences with these funds, such as the GCF, for example. Let me go back to the EU.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank the colleagues straight away from Palau, from Sudan, from Vanuatu, and from Fiji, and from other countries for sharing very concrete examples from your own experience and the experiences of your countries, which are very important for us to note in this discussion. While respecting the very valid experiences and limitations shared, I would like to take some time to speak about what is in place in terms of financing arrangements. There's a complex network of arrangements that extends beyond the scope of the UNFCCC and is supporting developing countries to avert, minimise and address loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change. Individual entities, including the operating entities of the UNFCCC financing mechanism, international financing institutions, as well as national budgets and other development and humanitarian finance, fulfill different functions within this network, and their response time and the nature of their programs can be effective at various stages. And I believe that we've already started to speak towards some of the different types of financing that are needed at different stages and for different types of responses. One example is CRUISE, that as we heard, is the WMO Climate Risk and Early Warning Systems program, and just to note that over 70 million has been pledged for 2021, and within this 4 EU member states provided finance there. The Santiago network is also another one that we see as having great potential to make this interplay more effective between the different agencies and the different parts of the puzzle we have, supporting the effective implementation of efforts to avert, minimise and address loss and damage in the most vulnerable countries, as well as to potentially help better identify areas where we could reinforce this framework. The EU is highly committed to international cooperation, and that's evident from the following concrete figures of EU support relevant to activities to avert, minimise and address loss and damage. The EU, with its member states, is the world's largest donor of development assistance. The EU is the top provider of official development assistance, with climate action increasingly integrated into this assistance. Additionally, the EU and its member states is the largest donor of humanitarian aid in the world, funding about 36% of global humanitarian assistance. It's also the largest contributor of public climate finance, and almost 50% of that was spent on helping partners to adapt to climate change. The EU and its member states contribute through a number of multilateral and bilateral channels and allocate resources to multilateral development banks and international financing institutions. And to be a little bit specific in terms of the topic today, we could speak about the Green Climate Fund and the examples of where support is provided there, to which the EU member state is the largest contributor, representing 52% of total pledges, or the Adaptation Fund, of which the EU member states provide 73% of all voluntary funding. And also we could look at the Least Developed Country Fund, of which the EU provides over 90% of the more than 180 million pledged. I'd like to also highlight within the European Commission, we have an instrument called the Neighbourhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument. It's got the terrible acronym of NDICI, and it has been set up from 2021 to 2027. And this instrument includes the European Fund for Sustainable Development. And within this, in recognition of the growing climate challenge and the support to the most vulnerable countries in terms of adapting to, and also in terms of preparing for and reducing risk from and responding to the crisis, it's got 35% of all of that is dedicated to climate finance. Thank you.
Thank you, EU, for the intervention and for highlighting some of the new points, such as your contribution on the development assistance, as well as humanitarian assistance. And you highlighted the GCF, your contribution to the GCF and the Adaptation Fund, and your contribution to climate finance as a whole. I'm hoping that parties will react to that and narrow it down to loss and damage, because it's quite a big envelope that you put on the table, but we need to narrow it down and see whether it fits squarely within the loss and damage. But thank you for that intervention. We now go to the Philippines.
So thank you, Mr. Chair, for giving the Philippines the opportunity to manifest our general response. This is to hopefully fast track the completion of this dialogue and achieve the most needed outcome, since it is clear that all of us, that climate change is real and has been causing havoc, affecting lives, livelihood, and health and longevity of economies. So borrowing from the words of the Executive Secretary in her opening statement in the GCA workshop this morning. So we now share our views and recommendations for consideration, and these are based primarily on how the Philippines cope with assisting communities that suffer losses, damages because of disasters we attributed to climate change. So to address loss and damage arising from the climate change, a preposition fund should be established, which may be called the Glasgow Facility for Loss and Damage, from which to quickly draw funds to support disaster-affected countries. So this facility should be sourced from annual contributions of developed countries, parties, so based on their historical responsibilities under the Convention and the Paris Agreement. So this should be in addition to other risk transfer mechanisms, such as but not limited to catastrophe bonds, parametric insurance, forecast-based financing, and crop insurance, some of which are in place on pilot basis. So the release of loss and damage Glasgow facility shall be triggered by nationally determined thresholds based on the extent of losses and damages and the relief needed by affected area. So in the Philippines, a declaration of the state of calamity is the trigger for the release of a quick response fund to assist affected communities. So the proposed facility should cover the amount of loss and damage brought about by the climate-induced slow onset and extreme hazard events. So the funds should be predictable, stable, and easily accessible. On mechanisms that have been effective, so there are a couple, but what needs to be enhanced is the sustainability of such mechanisms. It is mandatory to capacitate trainers in an innovative approach that will integrate traditional knowledge in research and development to inform policies. So invest in data capabilities with the aim of informing and enabling relevant government units to gain greater access to direct financing. So a blended approach in financing, which considers propriety of grant, investments, and subsidies as appropriate on the needs and nature of operations of public and private stakeholders, and a robust and deliberative monitoring and evaluation systems that will inform development needs to address the gaps. As for ways to improve and utilize synergies and complementarities, the modalities and procedures in accessing global funds should be efficient, streamlined, and simplified. And most importantly, unnecessary conditionalities should be removed. So while the Philippines are just for clear distinction between the loss and damage and adaptation measures, and even while there are established mechanisms, the existing capacities are overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the impact and the compounding nature of climate events. So the existing financing resources and instruments on the local level are not enough, have limited applicability for addressing loss and damage. So this is the reason for our strong voice not to preclude immediate action and support, and for Glasgow facility on loss and damage to be set up and made available now, not a day later. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Philippines, for answering the 4 questions. We were taking them one by one. We're still on the first one, but we've captured your intervention as it addressed all of them all at once. I think we were starting to get clarity on some of the arrangements that might be there or not be there based on the previous interventions. But I'll go to Mexico to continue with that question.
Thank you, Facilitator. We acknowledge the contributions already done by developed countries to attend this matter. This is also a priority for Mexico in its international cooperation programs. Nevertheless, we are concerned that mainly efforts made on trying to finance and loss and damage are for disaster risk reduction. And we know that all disasters are not always a climate change effects. We support was just Fiji say that the access to finance is really complicated. So we think that we should explore the mandates that we already have in the mechanisms that we already have and address the emergency of preparedness, resilience, and recuperation of communities, livelihoods, and ecosystems. IPCC explained it yesterday and in a really comprehensive view that in its working group to assessment report, adaptation is critical to upgrade small-scale, fragmented, and reactive efforts, but it will not prevent, avert, or minimize all losses and damage. Also, in addition, and not speaking about the finance, we would like to see other relevant actors in the dialogue, such as UNESCO, to support the work to attend the non-economic losses. We think that their inputs will be really great, important for us. And also we think that we should work with the LCIP to attend the indigenous people necessities on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Mexico. I think Sudan want to react to some of the interventions, but I also note that we have the observer, but Sudan, go ahead. And I come to the flag up there, it says observer. Sudan.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would also like to thank colleagues who made some intervention. I would like to thank the EU for explaining about the existing different type of sources. I guess the way the sources of financing, the way it's structured, most of it I think is going to maybe adaptation and to development in general. And I guess they might be overlap in issues related to maybe minimizing and addressing loss and damage. However, I guess when it comes to minimizing and averting loss and damage, however, when it comes to addressing loss and damage, I guess there is almost nothing dedicated to addressing loss and damage. And unless because I notice sometimes the work of humanitarian is being considered as because it is disaster, but Mexico has just rightly said it that not every disaster risk reduction is climate related. For example, if you look at the peacekeeping agenda, I mean this is a huge agenda that takes hell of a lot of money from the humanitarian action. I guess they are also opportunity coming from private sector, from developed world. However, these are not accessed. Like I said, when it comes to challenging, people might be able to talk a lot about that, because I will say the example of Morocco and climate resilient infrastructure for when we are talking about the challenge. However, I was just saying, I'm trying to say we are not pinpointing the the money dedicated to loss and damage per se, because that would be helpful for us, because here we are trying to identify what is really loss and damage. Maybe we are still having some challenge, but I mean the discussion could still be helpful, because if we underline very specific things, even in terms of private sector or whatever, which is, for me, I don't see it absolutely helpful, because I understand for many or even most or all the African countries, engagement or with private sector in business or related to loss and damage, and that is quite challenging. But I guess addressing loss and damage is the challenge that we are dealing with. Thank you.
Thank you, Sudan, for making it interactive and reacting to some of the interventions by the EU. I'm sure the EU would also want to respond at some point if they so wish. Allow me to go to the observer and come back this side. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. This is Laura Schäfer speaking from Germanwatch on behalf of Climate Action Network. From the perspective of CAN, a lot of countries already mentioned it, also there is no proper financial arrangement existing for loss and damage, and there's also no adequate loss and damage finance being provided. I think there are these two things that are important. And this gets really visible when we look at who is currently paying for loss and damage. These are the households, the most vulnerable households. There is a recent study by IID which concludes that rural Bangladesh households are spending almost 2 billion a year on repairing the damage caused by climate change and on prevention measures. And this is 2 times the amount that the government of Bangladesh spends, and 12 times more than international donors. And of course, when we talk about funding arrangements, there's this inside and outside UNFCCC perspective. And looking at the inside perspective, we recently conducted a study by looking at the potential of the current UNFCCC financial architecture to finance loss and damage. And what we found, one of the key messages, is that the current financing mechanisms and modalities of the UNFCCC funds are just not suitable for funding all relevant loss and damage activities that were analyzed, particularly measures to address loss and damage immediately following an extreme event, as well as slow onset processes at an early stage of occurrence, which would need rapid and large-scale financing, are not possible to fund through the current architecture. And this owes particularly to the financing mechanisms, with exception to the GCF, all funds are grants-only funds, and the type of funding accessible through the funds, which we already heard is primarily distributed through multi-year projects with a really long application and pre-project phase. That's nothing you need for rapid response. And the general mandate of the funds, which was already mentioned, which is very much focused on adaptation and just doesn't allow for these types of relevant activities to be financed. And then looking at the outside, we have to acknowledge that there are a multitude of initiatives providing finance, and for example, the international climate risk financing architecture has evolved significantly over the last 10 years. But on the one hand, there is a lack of financing for a lot of relevant instruments for them to meet the real needs of developing countries. We've heard a lot already yesterday, humanitarian aid is not sufficient. And there are many instruments relevant to address loss and damage, but they lack adequate financing to reach real scale and fulfill their potential, like social protection. The second problem is that there is also a lack of coverage for all relevant risks and impacts, particularly for slow onset processes and non-economic loss and damage, where support is still largely absent, also outside UNFCCC. And another challenge is that these outside arrangements are based on biomultilateral agreements, and at the moment these funds are often not distributed on a needs basis, informed by climate risk analytics, but donors often make unilateral decisions on the allocation of funds. And hence, from the CAN perspective, this dialogue needs to result in concrete outcomes, how to improve this situation and provide adequate new and additional support for those most vulnerable in the countries to address loss and damage, and otherwise this dialogue would fail from our perspective. And the two results relevant from our perspective is the loss and damage financing facility, which was already mentioned by a lot of countries, which should be set up at COP27, and the rest of the dialogue should be used to operationalize it. And there's also a process needed to identify the needs of developing countries regarding loss and damage finance, something that is also not there. And this also needs more than one dialogue per year. The next dialogue will only happen next year. It means a follow-up process from now to COP would be needed, and also a proper agenda item for this to be discussed at COP27. Thank you.
Thank you, German Watch. Speaking as German Watch and Ken, for reiterating many of the points that there's no really proper arrangements within the UNFCCC. But I noted that you hinted that outside we need to acknowledge that there are some initiatives, but the problem with those is that they are not at scale. There's not enough spread or coverage, and then you are starting to come to the improvements that would be required, and I'm sure you'd come back as we go to other questions to elaborate on that. I go to Switzerland and finally Vanuatu.
Thank you very much, co-facilitator, and good afternoon to everyone. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to be here and participate in this dialogue, and thanks also for the format of these breakout groups, which are a bit more interactive than this big room we had yesterday. And I hope with this Glasgow dialogue is that we can come to a better mutual understanding of what already exists across the development, DR, humanitarian, and climate communities of practice, if I can call them that. Given the breadth of topics that are relevant for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, but also to see which activities are not sufficiently covered by the existing architecture in order to be able to have a comprehensive response to the issues of loss and damage. With regards to the arrangements for funding of activities, so I guess for the first question, we know that some are part of climate finance, but that's only one part of it. Some are more within the disaster risk reduction space, some more within the humanitarian space, and some more in the development space, also in terms of longer term recovery. But these different spaces don't all use the same language when they refer to these kind of activities, and so often they won't be referring, for example, to terminology of averting, minimizing, or addressing loss and damage, but many of the activities that are done are often quite relevant. And one that we heard a bit from yesterday in the plenary was from the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, for example, GFDR, and that has quite an integrated approach of looking both ex ante and ex post at different elements to be able to respond on the full spectrum. So it includes early warning systems, for example, but also comprehensive risk management, livelihoods, also slow onset events, and preparedness and recovery. And we, as Switzerland, specifically provided funding to strengthen the climate resilience dimension of this fund, which initially came more from the disaster risk reduction community and perspective, but to really build in those slow onset events, and now also increasingly, for example, nature-based solutions to deal with some of the losses that are being faced in ecosystems, with then the impacts on the communities that depend on those ecosystems. To give another example that my colleague from the EU also referred to, the Climate Risk and Early Warning Systems Initiative, just to complement with one element of the way we're also trying to make these initiatives more responsive but also more accessible. We established this year, as part of this cruise initiative, it's called an accelerated support window, and that's a new financing window to respond to demands and priority needs from LDCs and SIDS in a faster manner, and this is going to be rolled out this year. And then I hope this is it will be then very useful to get feedback on how this works, how this can be improved to also improve these existing mechanisms that are there. Maybe for the next questions, I'd also be interested to get that we share experiences also on experiences with the UN Central Emergency Relief Fund, which is also increasingly developing anticipatory action. It's still a relatively small part of this fund. So this is one of the major UN funds that kickstarts relief efforts immediately after a disaster. But of course, that's one small part of the spectrum. That's more the immediate relief. That's not so much for long-term recovery, for example. And we're also encouraging this fund to work in a more anticipatory manner and to better respond also to climate risks, which is already becoming a part of its work. I don't want to go into too many examples, but just another one that I wanted to flag here, which is the IFRC Disaster Relief Emergency Fund. We also heard briefly from that yesterday. It's also a fund that we support from Switzerland. We think this is also an innovative approach to try to provide support before a crisis hits and then also immediately after. So they're also piloting new modalities there, and also trying, as you know, IFRC then works very much also with local actors and communities which are closest to the immediate response. So I also be curious in the rest of the dialogue if we can hear examples also of, or your experiences also interacting with this mechanism. On coral reefs, it'd be interesting, or ecosystems, to see how GEF and other biodiversity-related initiatives are also addressing this, because it's very much also they're threatened from many drivers, including climate change, which is very much threatening many of those ecosystems, but it adds a layer to work that's also ongoing, and biodiversity funds are increasingly taking a climate lens, but perhaps not sufficiently so, and if there are gaps, there may be also guidance or encouragements that we can give to such funds. So I've already spoken a lot, so maybe I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Co-Facilitator, for now. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm starting to hear a lot of you going into the second question, which is really about the support that has been effective in minimizing and addressing loss and damage, and the lessons. We haven't come to the lessons learned to improve funding and the practices that can be replicated. So if you allow, I'm going to go back to the European Union, Vanuatu, and USAID online, but I will also, if you so wish, I would also like you to address the second and the third questions, which in my view are related, because the third is really about the barriers and challenges that countries face in this. So, but let's complete the discussions on the first, but I give you an allowance, EU and Vanuatu, to go into the second and the third question, and I'm sure the USAID would want to contribute to the three questions as well. So I'm starting with the, who was first? Oh, okay, Vanuatu, yes.
Thank you, Chair, and we very much appreciate this dialogue. This is now where we're getting into the real meat of how we're going to mobilize finance to address loss and damage. I want to start with the humanitarian contributions. Several have raised this incredibly important source of starting to address loss and damage, and humanitarian support has been absolutely essential in the Pacific. In Vanuatu, it has saved lives, and this needs to be very, very much acknowledged and appreciated. In many cases, humanitarian support was immediate. It quickly reached those who most needed it, but in other cases, it didn't, and so there are certainly gaps. What I want to be very clear about, however, is that humanitarian support is not the end of the story for addressing loss and damage. And as I've raised before, in most cases when it comes to slow onset events, there is no trigger for humanitarian support. So I think we've made that clear. I've also noticed, however, that humanitarian in Vanuatu, as is per its mandate, is very much about addressing the life-saving needs of people. Once it addresses starvation, lack of food, lack of water, and basic shelter, that's the end. It doesn't look at the long-term consequences of loss and damage from climate change. One example in Vanuatu, we had a Category 5 cyclone a few years ago, wiped out 60% of our GDP. The humanitarian response was just a fraction of that financial cost. And even the recovery funding that came through was still only a fraction of the cost of the real losses and damages. We put together a post-disaster needs assessment to look at financing needs to cover loss and damage. And we put together an entire environmental proposal for long-term activities to address that environmental loss and damage. And until today, this was in 2020, until today, no donor has stepped up to actually fund the environmental proposals that we put, the activities that we put forward to address environmental loss and damage. And so there's a huge gap here, particularly in these non-economic proposals, real proposals to address loss and damage. I wanted to also bring up the issue of coral reefs, and this is an issue close to my heart as a marine biologist. And yes, we have received support for minimizing risks, climate risks on coral reefs, and this is an essential area of support for the Pacific Islands. We depend on coral reefs for our lives, our livelihoods, our economic generation. And what we've done, we have implemented, at the advice of experts, marine protected areas and reserves to protect coral reefs. We have put in place gear and catch restrictions to prevent degradation on coral reefs. We've done coral mariculture, where we've started to replant coral reefs, even using species of coral which have been identified as particularly resilient to climate impacts. We've put in place fish aggregating devices and coral mariculture to remove pressures on coral reefs. But all of that combined has not been able to withstand the absolutely terrifying impact of coral bleaching, and not just one event, but multiple events of coral bleaching. It hasn't been able to withstand the predators of coral reefs, which, like coral crown of thorns starfish, which are climate related when you have increased temperature, that are eating the coral reefs faster than they can regenerate. It hasn't been able to withstand the ocean acidification, which no matter what type of species of coral you do, when you have acidifying oceans beyond the capacity of coral reefs to grow, and then cyclones, which wipe out the whole reef in its entirety. So it doesn't matter what kind of investment you put at the front side of minimizing risks. Once you experience the real loss and damage, then there's just simply no mechanism that can address now the loss of culture, the identity, the food security that reefs bring. And this is where we need a completely new approach to financing loss and damage when it comes to coral reefs. So really good discussions, thank you for that. But I hope these examples show just what level of exposure and risks now we're experiencing on the loss and damage side.
I think you did a good job in indicating the support that has been provided. And you just stopped short at the challenges that are there. And now we also need to talk about the improvements that are needed within that example of coral reefs, for example, improvements on funding that would complete the picture. But I think that was a very good start. Let me turn to the European Union, and then I'm going to go online to USAID.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to come back in. And again, thank you to the colleagues who have shared what I think is incredibly valuable information and incredibly valuable experiences already to this process. While I did in the intervention speak about the broader financing framework within which the European Union operates, that's to say that, you know, we do see averting, minimising and addressing crossing a range. It's quite a broad spectrum of activities, and we do see that there is relevance in really looking at the broad range of actors that are already there, and also ensuring that those actors are present also in the Glasgow dialogue. Not to say that they are currently addressing all of these needs, because I think it's quite clear from the interventions already that that's not the case, but to be able to contribute in terms of what is being done and what has been learned over decades, and in particular to take humanitarian action as an example. I think the humanitarian action community has changed their business of operation significantly over the decades. In particular, you know, it's come a long way from disaster response, in and out kind of operating, to having this broad spectrum of comprehensive risk management, and mainstreaming preparedness and humanitarian aid operations, scaling up anticipatory actions and bolstering resilience and recovery in vulnerable communities. In fact, 65% of all of EU-funded humanitarian projects have included a disaster preparedness component over the last 5 years, and 90% of disasters are now climate-induced. So it's an incredibly important community to have in the conversation, and I would point to OCHA, for example, as a key partner to engage in these discussions. In the interest of time, I won't go into a huge amount of detail. I'm just going to list some of the partnerships more specific to loss and damage that we see as relevant and that I think are worth noting as to see how to engage better also in this process going forward. One is the INSEE Resilience Global Partnership that has been mentioned, and also the Global Risk Financing Facility, the Risk Informed Early Action Partnership, and also the Platform on Disaster Displacement, the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, as my colleague from Switzerland has already mentioned, the CRIF, the African Risk Capacity, and the Southeast Asia Disaster Risk Insurance Facility. There's also CRUISE and SOF, which is a new initiative that we think can add huge potential in terms of improving the data at source for many of these. And then for humanitarian relief, just to also reinforce that there are very different communities within humanitarian relief, and I think some colleagues spoke about the human impacts of loss and damage, and some of these being, for example, loss of education for children who have to be withdrawn from schooling. And I think it's important for these conversations that we do bring in the kind of actors and funds that have been set up to respond to these and are operating globally, such as the Education Cannot Wait Fund. And this is quite specific to one sector, but as an example of, these tailored approaches that have been developed, and it's worth bringing into the conversation, or how the Global Partnership for Education, which has very broad reach, has in recent years changed its approach to be able to better respond to these disasters that are constantly, interrupting their progress in terms of development and education. So thanks for giving me the time to come back in response to colleagues' requests. And did you want me to go on to the second question, or would you like to go to other parties at this stage? Go ahead with the second question. Okay, so in response to the second questions, in terms of what we see as effective in averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, I'd like to focus on 4 elements that we've pulled out in terms of our experience that we think are particularly important here. One is that it's essential to take the holistic approach. So it's key to avoid fragmentation and adhere to internationally agreed principles. The EU sees averting, minimising and addressing loss and damage as covering a wide range of interconnected and overlapping activities, including across the humanitarian development climate nexus. Activities relevant to loss and damage are diverse, such as exposure, vulnerability and climate change hazards, and no single actor, modality or initiative will be sufficient to cover the range of needs. Effective responses will require working in harmony across communities of practice, and we see averting, minimising and addressing as essential considerations to effectively respond to climate-induced loss and damage. We would avoid response frameworks that could lead to fragmentation of efforts across communities. And within this, we would favour systemic approaches, recognising that climate change will have impacts at all levels of society and across all sectors of the economy. Cooperation, coordination and inclusive engagement with all relevant actors is key. This is in line with internationally agreed standards and principles, to name but a few: the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness, the Grand Bargain commitments agreed at the World Humanitarian Summit, which require us to enhance engagement between humanitarian and development actors, and of course the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. So the EU will continue to refer to the whole spectrum of averting, minimising and addressing loss and damage as a broader approach to avoid any fragmentation of efforts. And we are, of course, ready to look at different elements of this spectrum, including ex ante and ex post, and thematic areas such as those outlined under Article 8 of the Paris Agreement for more detailed discussions on specific areas. The second is to focus on the most vulnerable populations and groups. In spite of the growing humanitarian impact of climate change, far too little global finance is reaching the most vulnerable communities. None of the 20 most vulnerable countries to climate change and climate-related disasters features among the top 20 per capita recipients of climate change adaptation funding, according to the IFRC World Disasters Report in 2020. The EU will continue to advocate for directing significantly more climate funds towards enhancing resilience and adaptation where they're needed the most. Unequal exposure and vulnerability to climate change impacts of different regions and socio-economic groups worsens pre-existing inequalities and vulnerabilities. Therefore, we will continue to apply a lens of vulnerability and gender to our analysis of the funding arrangements to avert, minimise and address loss and damage. The third is to focus on nationally owned, locally led and people-centred approaches. In line with the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness, any effective initiative to avert, minimise and address loss and damage must facilitate developing countries to set their own development strategies and improve national institutions. National policies and priorities, including but not limited to NAPs, NDCs, ADCOMs, national development strategies, disaster response strategies, form the basis for our cooperation. Climate-induced crises should be tackled in a holistic manner by addressing governance challenges too. International support in any crisis situation can only have a lasting effect if it goes hand in hand with a strong commitment by the national and local authorities to put people at the centre of its effort, by tackling exclusion, protecting rights, and ensuring accountability. And the fourth and final is innovative solutions. The EU will promote the further development and uptake of innovative solutions. And I think based on the conversation so far, it's very clear that we do need innovative solutions. But I have some examples of innovations that the EU has scaled up that are relevant to averting, minimising and addressing loss and damage, or that we are seeking to scale up further. One is to expand support for cash-based, shock-responsive social safety nets, such as the Emergency Social Safety Net in Turkey, which is the biggest humanitarian programme in the EU's history. To further develop and apply risk-informed approaches, including risk financing, and scale up anticipatory action in different humanitarian contexts and regions. To bolster climate and environmental resilience of vulnerable populations through the Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus approach. To significantly increase the share of climate funds dedicated to enhancing resilience and adaptation in the most disaster-prone countries and regions, and to increase EU support to local responders, including by expanded use of country-based pooled fund and other funding mechanisms that prioritise local actors. Thank you.
Thank you, EU, for also addressing the second question and giving clear examples there on some of the practices that can be scaled up or replicated. I'm going to go online. We are going to try this with USAID.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. I wish I was in the room to have that energy and motivation with you all. Thank you for having me virtually. First, let me say that we welcome this dialogue, and I'm very happy to be joining this conversation today. And I also want to mention that I'm coming from the humanitarian side, so let's have that caveat with you while I talk. As we talk and heard, there are a variety of sources of support of activities relevant to averting, minimizing, addressing loss and damage, and we should look to strengthen improving this existing institution, as there's a lot of gaps and challenges many of the colleagues stated. As we heard yesterday, a variety of sources of support relevant to this discussion, and it spans from humanitarian assistance, development, disaster risk reduction, and adaptation communities. Since COP26, we have been intensely focused on mobilizing our agencies and experts to identify how we can advance efforts on avert, minimize, and address. And this exercise again demonstrate that the broad range of activities, actors, and resources to support. As we look at this, we need to, coming from the humanitarian assistance side, as many colleagues, I think EU and Switzerland and others mentioned, that the disaster or humanitarian communities has been working decades on and working on the continuum of humanitarian assistance, from response, disaster risk reduction, preparedness, recovery, and resilience. So we should look across averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage as a continuum, as many of you stated, fragmented approaches that is taking a toll on the communities and countries. The United States, we support to help address LND. We are one of the single largest donor in humanitarian support. In 2021, we supported $8.2 billion in humanitarian assistance. And we supported several risk pools. Department of Treasury provided funding the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. Again, I'm talking about the continuum and different approaches, how this continuum work together to avoid those fragmentation. So Department of State also announced our support to EDRIFI, a multi-donor trust fund managed by the African Development Bank, and the premium support the capacity building of ARC members. We are looking through our development finance cooperation, support ensure resilience, investment fund, which helps micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises and businesses and low-income families access and use of insurance. As part of G7, we were grateful Germany's leadership, and we support strengthening the global climate and disaster risk finance architecture and work toward a global shield that will close the protection gap for vulnerable communities and countries. On migration, I want to mention that White House released last year a report on impact of climate change on migration, and this report will guide our efforts in the U.S. Formulation of policy responses and multilateral engagement targeting the nexus of climate crisis and migration. I just want to give a few examples about avoiding, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. I know it's not clear-cut, and I know there's a lot of people involved. As mentioned earlier, it's a whole community approach. We cannot do this alone. So let me give you an example. Coming from the science background, I would say climate information services and early warning system is a critical part of this. Early warning and climate information can help people adapt. Coming from, again, the disaster side, we've seen the loss of lives due to early warning system has been reduced significantly. Information can be used to better make decisions and risk-informed decisions. For example, when to plant and what crops to plant, and help avoid, minimize loss and damage. In some cases, improve even the productivity despite the climate change. We in USAID, a good example is our Family Early Warning System Network, provide early warning of food insecurity and triggers bilateral and multilateral assistance for humanitarian action before disaster fully unfold. So one of the most effective way of avoiding, minimizing, and addressing disasters. Early warnings also can trigger insurance payouts like ARC case. It is not only it can be difficult to separate, avoid, minimize, and address, but we also know that these type of actions are most effective when they're taken together in a comprehensive risk management approach. There's a couple of things I want to mention. In our work, we recently released our climate strategy, and that's looking at different, one addressing the targeted direct action, is other is system approach. But in implementing this, I also want to mention that early warning, early action is critical in saving lives, saving some property, and in some cases, assets. But I also want to emphasize the locally led responses and inclusion are foundational principles that should be incorporated in all planning and activities. Our support is intended to respond to partner countries and communities, their priorities, and elevate locally led action. Equity and justice is a big issue in climate change adaptation, as well as loss and damage. We heard that different climate impacts, responses, and concerns from the parties that spoken yesterday, while we much learn from other tools that avoiding, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage will be effective, approach must be tailored to the local context. It is also critical, again, from large experiences from the humanitarian side, it's critical that we work across silos. This is to scaling up the previous lessons I mentioned earlier, making a step change in how we approach this issue. One other thing I want to mention, at COP26, President Biden launched the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, or shortly PREPARE, which will serve as the cornerstone of US government efforts to help more than 500 million people in developing countries adapt and manage the impacts of climate change. And we are working as a whole government approach in these synergies. I'm gonna stop there. Thank you so much for giving me the floor.
Thank you, USAID. And just to appeal to colleagues to be crisp in your interventions. I have a weakness that the more you speak, the more I lose you. I get lost. So sometimes if you just go straight into the points, make examples, you are free to come back again. But and I think this is not just my experience. Many of us have this sort of experience. So to make it more interesting and so that we listen to each other, we react to each other, let's make it direct to the point. But having said that, I go to Chile.
Thank you. I think Fiji was first.
Sorry, Fiji, you understand our problem. Please go ahead.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Chile. So because it's been asked for into the room and through the questions, I would like to now discuss from the perspective of Fiji some innovative solutions that Fiji has initiated to avert, minimize and address loss and damage. And I do that for a couple of reasons. I do it partly because I think it's very important that we don't just see the Pacific and other regions as acted on by climate change and climate impact. All of these spaces have agency of their own. People are not just sitting around and being impacted upon by climate change. They're also creating their own innovative responses. And I'd also just like to say that while humanitarian relief is a very important part of this set of, the broader network that is going to provide responses in this to loss and damage issues, it is one part of the network. It is not the whole solution. And there are a set of different arrangements that will be required. So they're just my opening remarks. There are 4 innovations that I want to raise with you today. So the first one that I want to discuss with you is Fiji's Relocation Trust Fund and relocation strategy that consists of a range of different initiatives. One is a relocation trust fund that has financed the relocation of a number of communities in Fiji, with many more communities on the list. This is also supported through a relocation policy and the Climate Change Act as well. Now, from a Fiji perspective, this has been incredibly innovative in terms of the regional approach to relocation and resettlement issues. It has been difficult to secure donor funding to do this. The donor funding that has been secured has been very much secured around bricks and mortar relocation. It has not taken a broader loss and damage approach. It hasn't looked at issues of cultural heritage. It hasn't looked at broader issues of ancestral connection to place. This is Utake land. This is land belonging to Fijian communities and people. This is thousands of years of ancestral connection to place. It is very hard for communities to relocate. So when we raise these issues of loss and damage, when we raise these issues of non-economic loss, of cultural loss, these are the kinds of issues that we're raising with you and we're raising into the room. The second innovation that I want to talk about is one called the Drua Incubator. So a Drua is a kind of vessel. In February 2008, Fiji began a homegrown financing solution in partnership with the government of Luxembourg, and this was a package of around €1 million to support the Drua Incubator, a tool for leveraging financial innovation and private sector engagement to address climate change challenges in Fiji and in the Pacific more broadly. The special idea behind this incubator is that it was the development of innovative, affordable, profitable and durable climate financing products around risk transfer-based products in Fiji and the Pacific. And the idea is the development of new financing and risk transfer products. So one of those is the first one that I want to discuss with you. So this is innovation number 3, which is the new parametric insurance product that Fiji has developed in partnership with UNCDF, where 1,388 individuals are currently covered by this product through the UN Capital Development Fund, the first low-cost parametric insurance product in the Pacific that's been piloted across the first insurance season via mobile wallets. And again, it works just like any parametric insurance product, so it pays out in a Fiji context on the basis of high wind speed and heavy rainfall. And the last product that I want to talk to you about, or the last innovation I want to talk to you about, is, because it was raised particularly by Switzerland, is the enabling environment for coral reef insurance and risk transfer product, which has been designed through an ADB technical assistance project for coral reef insurance. And it isn't quite up and running as yet, but it's basically going to use Fiji's environment assets around private companies, resorts, communities and the informal economy as a basis for creating a new set of insurance products, developing risk transfer products for coral reefs and fragile marine ecosystems with high tourism value in particular. So we do innovate. We work really hard to innovate with what is available in this space. But let me stress, while we have stories of success and while we have stories of resilience, these wins are on a very small scale relative to the scale of need. We are innovating, we are piloting, we are attempting with very small amounts of money to do the things that our communities and villages require of us. And this is something that happens across the Pacific. So we strongly suggest that the Glasgow dialogue focus on tangible steps that we can take to address these critical loss and damage related financing needs. It needs a robust process with meaningful timeframes, accountability and clear deliverable outcomes so that we can start talking around these absolutely needed and required finance products. We need a loss and damage finance fund. We need these solutions. We need financing arrangements that can address the impacts of slow onset events, that can address non-economic losses such as impacts on life and ways of life, health impacts. We have dramatic impacts in increases of dengue because of climate impacts throughout the region. We have all kinds of other health impacts. I mean, everywhere across the globe you can hear similar stories. Impacts on cultural heritage, impacts on ancestral connections to land. We need finance products that can be sustained in the long term, that aren't just pilot projects, that aren't just one-off innovations because a donor likes the sound of something at a particular point in time. And we need finance products that meet principles around transparency of access direct access and focuses on climate vulnerable countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiji, for that. Clear examples on innovations in Fiji. And I think this is the value of the dialogue. We are learning a lot about practices in various countries, but the message really coming out there is the support to these national innovations that is required. And parallel to that, really a robust international system that can support those national innovations. I think that's quite. We can learn a lot from each other on this sort of innovations, but we can also see the limitations on the other hand, and what is really required to replicate those, on to scale up some of those sort of innovations. Chile, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, facilitator, for giving me the floor again. I would like to address the second and third questions, just very briefly, to tell you about the Chilean case, our experiences with the funds under the UNFCCC. So Chile has had access to the Adaptation Fund, and we have some projects in the country. And we think that's a good experience. We think that's a fun financial mechanism that works very well for us, especially because it's for a direct access for the countries, and that's something that we see is positive. But of course, the resources of the Adaptation Fund are very limited. And in the case of my country, it has allowed us to implement some pilot projects in some areas in agriculture, and also disaster risk management, early warning systems in another region of Chile, joint project with Ecuador. So it has been actually a very good experience, and it's a fund that works very well for us, and also, but the times are extended. I mean, a couple of years we took to present and the project to be approved, but it works quite well. Even our resources are limited, and that's something that that's adaptation again. That is not loss and damage. And yesterday, the Adaptation Fund was clear that they had not the mandate to address loss and damage. So that's something that we have to point out. But it's a good experience. Also, regarding the Green Climate Fund, for instance, and here I echo the words of Fiji that she said before in the first questions. For us, it has been very difficult to access the resources of the Green Climate Fund. It's a long process, and it's a stony process. So we have been able to access resources to prepare the national adaptation plans. But again, this is adaptation, and it's not implementation of adaptation measures, or implementation, or what we can call minimizing loss and damage in a way, because it's not exactly loss and damage, it's adaptation. But is for preparing our national adaptation plans, which are under the readiness program of the Green Climate Fund. And even under the readiness program, that has been very difficult and very, very long process. So for us, we wouldn't want to replicate something like that, some experiences like that. We would want something that would be of direct access for the parties, and that would be flexible in different ways. And another thing I wanted to mention is that, we have been benefit from those fundings in other areas, and we are very grateful for that. Again, but not under the loss and damage. And the last thing that I wanted to say is that what we think, and this is ILAC position, is that we see that a facility could focus on addressing loss and damage. That's where we see that's the biggest gap, because averting and minimizing are covered in a certain extent, not all the way, but in a certain extent. So addressing is the biggest gap for us. And also on what is on the issue of slow onset events, we think that that area is actually not covered right now in anywhere, not under the UNFCCC, not under the humanitarian assistance or the disaster risk management, or all the things that have been said now by the persons that have spoke previously. So we think that that area is definitely not covered, and there is a gap also, and we shouldn't wait for the international system outside the UNFCCC to address this gap, because these are losses and damages due to climate change. So the UNFCCC, the convention, the COP, and the CMA should take this into their hands. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chile, for addressing some of the barriers that you are facing. For example, these long approval processes in the GCF and so forth. And thank you for really outlining some of those barriers. I hope at the end of the day we would have a list of such barriers and see what we do about them. Next on my list is Palau.
Thank you, Chair, for allowing me to come back. I too like to share some of the, maybe one or two innovations that we've done in Palau that also we need support on. And bear with me as I go along on this system. In 1998, when Palau first experienced its major coral bleaching, many questions were popping up in the air, what was happening. And so we brought in an expert we worked with the Nature Conservancy. They brought in some expert, and then we found out that in one particular bay, the ecosystem was still intact from the coral bleaching. And from that, we started working with the Nature Conservancy, trying to figure out why. And then we found out through our own approach and scientific that because the bay was untouched by human activities, it allowed that to recover. It allowed the corals to sustain itself. So from there, we developed Palau. We started thinking of protected areas network. But that bay was under the protection jurisdiction of the traditional leaders of three separate. They're close by, but they're three. And so we knew that in order for us to address some of these climate change, we just cannot look at from the Western point of view, but we also have to take into traditional knowledge and management as part of it. And so from Protected Areas Network, we started a series of community consultations all around Palau. We talked with the fishermen, we talked with the hunters, we talked with the growers, and they identified their hot spots, their rich biodiversity spots that they depend on. And we even collected some traditional knowledge. And so we knew that the community was aware, and we also were able to, in a way, reinforce the idea that because, yesterday we had IPPC giving us their report. Well, the community don't need to have IPPC to tell them what to do. They just look at the environmental indicators. For example, there are certain plants that when they have buds where they grow, or they have their first buds that come out, that will tell them that it will be a good time to start planting, because there'll be 3 to 4 months of no rain, or good rain, not torrential rain. Those plants right now, the weather pattern right now in Palau has caused those plants to, at one time, bloom all throughout the whole year. So climate change is actually impacting the traditional knowledge as when to plant, when to harvest. So from that point of view, we brought up to the national government, how can we support these communities? And so we enacted a national protected areas network with a sustainable financing. And the financing was actually built into the airline tickets, where $15 from that goes into a protected area network fund, and we established the agency outside of the government for transparency because we wanted to attract donors. To this day, we have not attracted any one donor. So that fund right now is solely dependent on the tourism numbers. Unfortunately, as we all know, COVID hit. It was a lockdown. And part of the protected areas network, it was actually to have the communities themselves establish their own protected areas network within their communities. And that funding was supposed to come down and support them, but they need to develop a work plan. But looking ahead, when we develop protected areas network, we decided, well, it cannot just be a Palau thing. So we went transboundary. So we established the Micronesia Challenge, and that's Palau, Republic of the Marshall Islands, Federal States of Micronesia, Guam, and the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, where we all collectively agreed that we will conserve 30% of our near shore and 20% of our terrestrial, effectively managed by the year 2030. And in doing so, we actually, like our friends from Vanuatu, we came up with a business model for an investment scheme. To this day, we were able to get some private sector to invest in it, but to this day, not one country has invested in that endowment fund. And the idea of the endowment fund is to anticipate this type of COVID incident, where if the tourist numbers drop, at least we had an endowment fund where it's managed and marketed by people in our countries that actually understand stock market. So we have some, but we have to draw that now to support the community. Basically, we're just supporting their salary because there's not enough to do the activities. So my colleague from Vanuatu talked about marine protected areas. In the Pacific, we do not separate land from the marine, terrestrial from the marine. They're both the same. They are brothers and sisters. Whatever happens in terrestrial will also impact the ocean. And so when we had the funding, our biggest challenge right now is, as reported by IPPC yesterday, we're in a 1.1 degree world now. So there are areas within protected areas that were exposed. So while we identify these resilient crops so we could plant them there to hold sedimentation, Lord and behold, there was a drought. That didn't work. But we keep on doing it, and then all of a sudden you have this torrential rain that washed all of these resilient, these grassroots to hold sediment and wash them down again. So we're always constantly in a battle. At the same time, with the intensity of the heat, now we have more frequent forest fires. And in doing so, it's also destroying our native plants, our medicinal plants, our native flora and fauna that we depend on for medicine. And yes, in the Pacific, a lot of us still depend on local medicine. And so when that happens, it goes back to what my colleague from Fiji and Vanuatu was saying. The traditional knowledge slowly is part of the slow and onset removal. And some of these marine, these areas, we call them ridge to reef. And in some of those areas, we have actually traditional villages and platforms from our ancestors. And those right now are being threatened by sea level rise. I can produce pictures to show you a platform. In fact, the origin of my family, my clan, their platform has been destroyed when I was in Warsaw by that typhoon. And so it's hard when I was growing up, when I asked my grandfather, where did we come from? Orally, he would tell me our origin started from there. There is this platform, there is this rock, there is this whole village. That's where and that's how we started migrating around the island. And so it's sad to say, because in that platform, my ancestors were buried there. After the typhoon we got there, the platform was totally destroyed. The bones were unearthed. We collected them. We rebuilt the platform. We put them back down where it was. And then sea level rise, Lord and behold, came. has destroyed that platform and has totally decimated those ancestral bones that we hold dear, because in the islands, where you come from matters. In the islands, your ranking and your status matters, and you have to be able to trace it back to your origin, to your origin. And so we have the Micronesia Challenge. We have an endowment fund, but we have received from the private sector, but we have not received from countries. These innovations that we talk about, it's something that we, the small islands, especially Palau, that we know it works for us. It's sad to say, but in most cases, funding comes, it's a donor-driven issue. It's not driven by us, the people that need it the most. We know what it works. And before I close, I'd just like to thank my colleagues from the EU. They funded a regional project in the Pacific. It's called SUPA, Scaling Up Pacific Adaptation. It actually looks at adaptation pilot projects and how we could scale it up. And one of the activities that we did was actually we scaled up our national radio station, because our broadcast of 16 states, our radio station only broadcast to 2 states. So it was through the EU SUPA program we were able to actually extend the range. And then last year Typhoon Chirigay came, and we were in the National Emergency Council. We were up 72 hours. The president of my country comes in and goes, "So hey, SUPA is working. We're able to notify people where to go, how to stay safe." And then he turns and says, "Joe, and then what? Can SUPA help us rebuild?" And like my colleague from Vanuatu, for us, rebuilding is not a short term, it's a long term. And even before I came, there was torrential rain, and it rained for a whole month. And so you could see crops being destroyed. Food security has been compromised right now in Palau. Traditional food that we depend on. And when that happens, then we have to depend on imports. And with the world crisis right now, imports are going to be very expensive. And they are expensive. And so we'll be dependent on other food sources that are not necessarily healthy for us. We'll depend on cheaper food sources that it's imported, that when we do eat it, and then we have NCDs, which is a common case in the Pacific, because now we have to depend on some of these imports. And so it goes beyond, again, my colleagues, it's a humanitarian in a sense that is loss and damage from slow and onset causes. I mean, the rain for a month is unheard of in Palau. Even I myself sometimes went crazy, like, when is this rain going to stop? And it's not just a drizzle. It's a tremendous rain that comes down. My wife's garden is destroyed. Yeah. So I have to face her when I get back, how I'm going to help her rebuild her garden. And that's not an easy task, Chair, especially if those who are married to women who really like to have a garden. Oh, imagine the work they have to put in there, and also the funds they have to put in there, the emotional and the funding support. So that's just me, but expand that across the entire Pacific. Because we depend on those small gardens on our day-to-day subsidies. If we cannot drive out because the gas is expensive, at least we have cassava at the backyard, at least we have bananas, at least we have taro behind the house. But those have been destroyed now because of these slow-moving, these changing weather patterns. And so I just like to say that, we do have innovative approaches that we have created in the Pacific. It's just getting donors to come to the table and for once agree to our principle that we know what works best, rather than them driving, telling us that you can get this money if you do this and this and that. No. If you give us the money, let us prove it to you that we can make it actually succeed. So that's the experience I wanted to share. There are more innovative experience, but due to time, I just like to share the Micronesia Challenge and the protected areas network, that we do have it set up, and we're just waiting for. So if we had this facility in place, maybe they could provide that funding, so in the future we could, on ourselves, as a revolving fund that funds some of these work that we do to build our own resilience. Thank you.
I think the room has had you very well, and really the question is not only about donors coming to the table, but also the question of how does one recover or get back from all these setbacks that you highlighted. So it's quite clear to everyone that the innovations do exist out there. But let me turn to WMO. I don't know if it's in the room or on the room. Yes.
Thank you, facilitator. And listening to the colleague from Palau, I was imagining that the La Nina event that's been now persisting for 2 years, which is a very unusual condition, is probably what's triggering this exceptionally heavy rainfall. And I wanted to address, actually, and that's just one example, this part of the second question that has to do with lessons learned about financing and what can be done to improve it. The World Meteorological Organization works through national meteorological and hydrological services to provide different kinds of information that can help with managing risks and averting loss and damage. Yesterday I spoke about early warning systems, which is a well-known example, but there are others. There are historical data sets that are used as a basis for parametric insurance. It can involve cataloging hazardous events so that the impacts can be unambiguously associated with the events that that have triggered them, so that adaptation efforts can be assessed for their effectiveness. It can extend to observations for tracking the slow onset events like sea level rise and acidification that have been mentioned. So the point I wanted to raise has to do with how finance is delivered and fit for purpose financing, not so much the quantity of financing, but how it's accessed. I'll give a very brief example, but one that I think people will largely be familiar with: the daily weather forecast. What may not be so easy to appreciate is that behind the daily forecast is an immense operational architecture which is global in scope, and it has global level centers that are running supercomputers. Here in Germany, we depend on 2 supercomputers that are run in the United Kingdom at ECMWF. And then you have regional centers and specialized centers that compile data sets. And then we have national meteorological services that are taking observations, but also adding value to those forecasts and downscaling those forecasts, and that's how you get the forecast on your phone. So now that we're looking at this much broader range of requirements that's being brought online by climate change, and the wide range of decisions that need to be supported that go well beyond the weather timescales and the one-size-fits-all forecast, we find that project by project funding is too piecemeal to really adequately support the strengthening of a global integrated cascading system like the one I just described. And that what we really need are some innovative financing mechanisms that are more flexible, that allow for this integration that's needed for parties to be able to get the information they need, so that they can access the global products, and that they can also feed their information into this global system that strengthens it for everyone. So the example that we've heard referred to, and I'll refer to it as well, is cruise, because cruise is fast and flexible, and it can support the essential science and the observations and services in a way that's not so strictly tied to project funding for individual countries. And so I just wanted to raise that there is a need to continue to innovate on the way financing is delivered, not just the quantities, because some of the very specialized needs such as the one that I mentioned, really are not well served by all of the existing mechanisms, and new ones like cruise are going to be needed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, the WMO, for highlighting that. We go to Vanuatu. Yes.
Thank you, facilitator. And again, I really am appreciating this dialogue. I think it's such a unique space that we've got to link some of the real stories that we're facing with loss and damage on the ground in communities in the Pacific and around the world, and some of the investments that are being made at the international level that we just heard from the WMO, connecting the dots. Again, though, I feel that we need a space, a decision-making space, so that we can finally craft the innovative structures, the finance facilities that we need to make sure that we roll out these connections. I wanted to make an intervention with some best practices and lessons learned that we've had in Vanuatu. And I neglected to mention actually one of the probably most significant sources of finance for addressing loss and damage that we've seen. And that is the source of families and communities themselves. And these are the unsung heroes that are actually filling the gaps on the international public finance for loss and damage. So when we have extreme events or when we're facing slow onset events, it's actually communities and people. And I wanted to highlight some of the best practices for how these people are financing loss and damage themselves, how our communities are doing that. And it's mostly through private sector. These are not large-scale corporations. These are the small and micro private sector in the Pacific. They're often the first ones and the only ones that are there actually addressing loss and damage. They're the ones who are driving the long-term addressing, the generational addressing. They're the ones who are rebuilding schools, houses, and they're the ones who are putting money, their own money, into shifting livelihoods away, for example, from coral reefs and coral reef fishing, and into new land-based agricultural activities. And I'd like to give a very specific example of cash-based transfer. We heard the EU talk about a pilot. We in Vanuatu piloted cash-based transfer using blockchain technology in recent years, and this is particularly exciting because it puts cash in the hands of those who are required to address loss and damage. In real time, you can see where individuals and communities are spending money, through which private sector entities they're using that money, and what we would love to see is that this is not just a humanitarian approach, that it doesn't end when the crisis phase ends, but that we can channel money to individuals and communities so that they can start to transform their livelihoods away from those livelihoods that are lost into livelihoods that may be sustainable into the future. A second area of best practice that we've experienced in Vanuatu is through partnerships with our civil society. Our NGOs, particularly our locally based community organizations, are those who have real buy-in and real experience and real investment in our communities. And I think channeling loss and damage finance through our NGOs is just one of the many ways that we see moving forward with a loss and damage finance facility. We have a recent GCF project with an implementing entity which is an NGO, and we could see the loss and damage finance facility channeling part of the funds through those NGOs. And the final lesson learned or best practice is the need to put money also into government budgets. So right now the Vanuatu government allocates 15% of its recurrent budget to climate change, and we have another 5% for emergencies. And often it's the government budget finance that can be most useful in addressing loss and damage. This is very different to a project modality where you apply in advance and you have to have an implementing entity that does the financial reporting. At the end of the day, probably the most effective use of money can come from governments themselves. The departments of agriculture and the Department of Water and Infrastructure, if they can get that straight into their recurrent budget, we can be much more responsive and needs-based, flexibly looking at emerging issues. We're thinking that the finance facility doesn't necessarily only have to be grant-based flows, that we can use different modalities like the special drawing rights and reallocation of special drawing rights from developed to developing countries. This is public sector finance, and the loss and damage finance facility could really be an umbrella that looks at these. Debt cancellation and debt relief. What we're trying to do is really give the fiscal space to governments to address loss and damage that's a much more long-term view than just 5-year projects or 3-year projects. So just some ideas about lessons learned which may then translate into the finance facility that we're asking for. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Because we are running out of time, I'm going to ask the parties that are going to speak to also address the last question in terms of what can be done to improve and utilize synergies and complementarities on some of these issues that have been raised, not necessarily the arrangements where there are no arrangements, but we need solutions after having listened to lessons learned, innovative solutions, the barriers that are there. So how do we improve from this current situation? And to tip us into that, I think it is Sudan on my list.
Thank you for giving me the floor again. I would also like to state that adding just to the issue of the experience, from the African perspective, looking at the African risk capacity has been one of the examples that that work. It's a facility initiated by the African Union for assisting countries during disaster. However, I guess the challenge with it is the issue of having to pay for premium costs in order to be able to access the facility. And in spite of the fact that there are some success stories with the ARC, which managed to support some countries upon disaster. However, I guess the issue of it's an insurance facility, and for that the cost of premium, which is really huge, because if you are going to use an insurance for a country, then you are talking about money that would be beyond the affordability of the countries. So I guess the issue of when we are talking about loss and damage, and the fact that the countries, listening just to the example of Bangladesh that was raised by German Watch, I guess the same case is happening in every African country. The poor has to address the loss and damage themselves. So it's about to what extent loss and damage could be provided to those who are really in dear need for it as grant rather than loan, or rather than getting engaged in a private sector system that cannot be accessible for most of the poor and vulnerable people, household and communities. So we are looking for a funding mechanism that would really provide something like that, because accessibility issues should not really challenge countries. And if you think about the issue of increase of risk is increasing with climate change. Now we are getting just the hint, and as the temperature increase 1.5 to 2, and the projections are now telling us we might be above 3 with business as usual. I guess I'm using my phone and somebody's phoning. Sorry. So the issue of how to make the good examples work, as well as how to manage to scale it up. We have been listening to very good example from different regions today and yesterday. However, I guess as Africa as a region, we are still far away from talking about success stories with funds and with support from developed countries and banks that would really assist countries upon disasters and put in place mechanisms. I earlier talked about the engagement of African country, which is Morocco, in the issue of infrastructure, climate resilient infrastructure. I mean, this is one of the issues that you need really, because we always talk about build back better, and build back better is really costly, and it's not an easy thing, because we were in a climate resilient agriculture in a workshop in Morocco, and it was shocking to see the presentation of Morocco and the European Bank, and they were talking about climate resilient infrastructure for agriculture that costs $1.9 billion, and yet not covering every part in Morocco. So I mean, this is the type of level of finance. Just think about if the country wanted to engage in climate resilient roads and bridge and everything, not just stopping at agriculture. So there are certain issues that working at the small scales, at community level and at the local level in Africa, like social safety nets. This should be explored, because I heard in the room people want to see what is working for communities being scaled up. So, however, the challenge is the limitation with finance and limitation of options, because every time, as if addressing loss and damage is just insurance, and it is not. I don't agree on that. There is limitation in option and limitation in coverage, because sometimes you see very good options and approaches addressing the loss and damage in certain part of the world. However, the opportunity of that is not existing. I think we need financial resources and that are sustainable and predictable and sufficient. And we need a financial facility like many of the G77 members have just mentioned, to avail resources to assist countries implementing the required approaches. And I guess the credibility of whatever we would be doing, including even Santiago network, I guess people started mentioning that it is one of the approaches. However, without resources for that facility network, I don't think it is going really to deliver on the on ground. I guess there's no one size that would fit everyone, so you need really to explore what is working with who, and start scaling under the financial mechanism that we hope to see working for the different part of the world. I would like to thank you and stop here.
Thank you, Sumaya. Indeed, it's not a one-size-fits-all, but thank you for indicating things that work even at a small scale, like these social safety nets, but still highlighting the challenge that you'd still be faced when you want to upscale and go big. And thanks for providing us with some of the solutions that we can start looking into. I will now jump to the Philippines.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair, and then good evening to everyone. So for the Philippines, we are being visited by on average of 20 typhoons a year, and a number of these are considered super typhoon. And we were mostly, I think we were one of the most affected by Typhoon Haiyan way back in 2013. And being mindful of that are the vulnerabilities of the Philippines to climate change. We established this People Survival Fund way back in 2012. And the government provides annual fund for this People Survival Fund. But the fund is not enough. It's only about around 20 million US dollar a year. And going back to Typhoon Haiyan, until now we haven't completed the housing projects for those who were left without home during the Typhoon Haiyan. And in 2018, we even established this Emergency and Resiliency Fund. In 2018, this is to providing fund for the restoration of power-related facilities. Um, um, Similar to the survival fund, this emergency and resiliency fund is not also enough. The fund is only around 13 million a year, US dollar. And we're talking here of highly capital intensive power related facilities. And even last year, we hit again by another super typhoon, the Typhoon Ray. And until now, no, after 4 months or 6 months, we haven't, some areas remain still without electricity. So because of this limited fund that we have. But during the calamities, we receive humanitarian aid from the different donor agencies, and we rely on the donations, as also mentioned by our colleague, that donations from our citizens, donations from our companies, to be able to provide foods for those people affected by these calamities. And to answer for the question number 4, the ways to improve and utilize synergies and complementarities. As I mentioned earlier, maybe we could look at the blended approach in financing by looking at the grant, investment, subsidies based on appropriate needs and nature of the operation, both for the from the public and private stakeholders, as well as the modalities and procedures in accessing global funds should also be efficient and streamlined, simplified, and most importantly, there should be unnecessary conditionalities that will be imposed to those who will access this fund. That's all, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you for those concrete solutions, and this point is coming over and over again about streamlining access. I think there's a big issue there, but thank you for also raising the issue of blended approach. There's a suite of things that can assist us to solve this particular problem. I see Singapore on my side of the table. Singapore, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Singapore would like to first support the statements made by our fellow SIDS, which has painted the picture of existing arrangements for the funding of activities to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage, or in some cases and in some aspects, the lack thereof, as well as the barriers and challenges that developing countries continue to face in accessing these arrangements for funding. To give some context, Singapore is a small island city-state, and with no hinterland to retreat to, loss and damage from extreme weather events, such as frequent and intensified flash floods, and the slow onset threat of sea level rise poses a real and existential threat to Singapore. Speaking on extreme weather events, we know too well that climate change-related natural disasters can wipe out developing countries' hard-earned developmental progress very quickly, as some of my fellow SIDS in the Pacific have poignantly expressed. Yet, in many developing countries, 90% of disaster losses are uninsured. Innovative financial solutions are therefore necessary for bolstering the region's financial and societal resilience to climate shocks and disasters. We heard from the CRIF yesterday on its good work in the Caribbean and Central American region. Closer to home, Singapore, with support from Japan and the World Bank, established the relatively new Southeast Asia Disaster Risk Insurance Facility, or SEADRIFT, in Singapore, which provides ex-ante climate and disaster risk and insurance financing solutions for ASEAN countries. I believe this was given a little shout out by the EU in her earlier remarks. SEADRIFT is actually the first regional catastrophe risk facility established in Asia, and it's a concrete example of how stakeholders in the region can innovate and create impactful new solutions that steer the region towards a more climate resilient future. SEADRIFT launched its first product in February 2021, which was a sovereign flood risk insurance product that provides cover against flood risk in Laos and can be expanded to additional countries in the region in the future. So to address part of the second question on practices that could be replicated or scaled up, we believe that there is scope to promote the establishment of such risk insurance facilities across the globe to strengthen the financial and societal resilience of vulnerable countries and communities in times of crisis. We can start perhaps by doing a stocktake to identify success factors, facilitate the sharing of best practices, and develop guidance on how such solutions can be replicated more widely. At the same time, we know that there are gaps, and this is not the be-all and end-all, as Sudan has raised with regards to premiums. And reforms could actually be made to the operating entities of the financial mechanism to enhance the funding of insurance for climatic events in such risk insurance facilities, including subsidizing the premiums that countries pay to be eligible for insurance payouts. As others have mentioned, my intervention does not touch on financing ex-post actions after disasters have hit, which relates more to the addressing aspect of loss and damage, as well as on slow onset events that countries such as Vanuatu, Palau, Fiji, and Chile have elaborated upon, and more also needs to be done there. And if I may, just touching a little bit on the fourth question on utilizing synergies and complementarities. Looking beyond the convention and the Paris Agreement, it will be important to rally multilateral development banks, international financial institutions, international organizations, etc., to come together and work on tangible projects across the loss and damage landscape. This could be showcased at COP27, which would then be a strong demonstration of the ability of public and private entities and funds working together to address critical loss and damage challenges on the ground. Lastly, Singapore would like to echo calls by others around the table for the Glasgow dialogue to lead to concrete recommendations towards a breakthrough on loss and damage financing. And as a first step, for the discussions at the first Glasgow dialogue to be captured, and for this and parties' input to feed into the second Glasgow dialogue next year, as was raised by the AOSIS chair at yesterday's plenary. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Singapore. I think you did a good job of addressing all the questions within a very reasonable amount of time. I think I see two more flags. We will first go with Switzerland, followed by Mexico.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Facilitator. And it's great to hear the excellent examples of innovation from colleagues around the room and on different aspects of this. It's very, very encouraging, and I hope we'll be able to continue deepening those discussions this year and then going forward also in the following Glasgow dialogues. I just wanted to share thoughts on a few points that were raised and then briefly turn to the remaining questions. On funding for slow onset events and also with a view to how to take the dialogue forward, I think it would be useful to take a deeper dive on some of the specific slow onset events and see if there are particular gaps on specific slow onset events. Because there is some funding for some slow onset events, such as droughts and desertification, loss of biodiversity. That's, as I mentioned previously, some of the biodiversity funds, including GEF, which has a broader mandate with including biodiversity, IUCN that we fund, for example, and we also have bilateral projects, but there are many other out there, and loss of biodiversity linked to climate change is one of these slow onset events. Land and forest degradation, also there is some support for that, but perhaps not sufficiently, of course, so that's one to look at. On glacial retreat and related impacts as another slow onset event, here there is also some support. We know bilaterally, Switzerland, as we're also faced with these challenges in the Alps and in mountain areas, we've been providing a lot of support in the Andes, in the Hindu Kush, Himalaya, and in Central Asia on, for example, glacial lake outburst floods, which are another hazard very far from what we're hearing from our colleagues from AOSIS, but it's another challenge linked also to the impacts of climate change. So there is some funding, but again, it might be useful to dig a bit deeper in some of those categories. And I think similarly also for different non-economic losses, when we speak of that in a category, it's very broad. We're talking about very different things, from loss of life to health, but also some more emerging issues which are like culture, like identity, where there quite possibly is much less support than for some of the other aspects. So again, going forward, it might be useful to then break down the discussion on some of these specific areas. I also wanted to give a few words on the references to the Adaptation Fund and to the GCF with regards to mandates or not on addressing loss and damage. On GCF, we did mandate them to continue providing support for activities relevant to averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. They gave us some examples yesterday, and in some of the documents they provided to the COP, I believe, of examples that they're funding on loss and damage. They presented some examples on slow onset events, also some examples on non-economic losses, although that's not a very big part of their portfolio at the moment, but also comprehensive risk management, for example. But like they said also, they're not set up for immediate response necessarily, and in our view, there is no facility that can then tackle all of those different aspects. We have, for immediate response, for example, as I was saying before, there are some good mechanisms that are out there that are working, and something like the GCF has longer processes to access funding, and that's not really fit for purpose for this kind of work. So it's one part of the answer, but only one of it. On the Adaptation Fund, they did note, indeed, like others said, that they don't have a mandate to finance loss and damage, but they did also say that they are funding some projects on addressing loss and damage, and that they also don't have any prescribed sectors or approaches, and that that the projects are demand-based. So I guess here that also takes us to how we understand adaptation, and I think some of us have a broader view, let's say, of adaptation / adaptation and resilience. Others see it a bit differently too. So it's also, to some extent, I think it's a matter of how we capture and to some extent try to break down these different elements in different language in a way. And just finally, two points that I wanted to make or echo, like Vanuatu and Sudan said, those bearing the brunt of impacts and even funding reconstruction with their own assets are the local communities, often the poorest, and sometimes they have to turn to negative coping mechanisms to deal with that. And here we really need innovation to better channel resources to local communities, and that's really easier said than done. There are some good examples. We heard a very promising example from Vanuatu. We're also working to increasingly work on innovative direct cash transfers and adaptive social protection. But there's a lot more that needs to be done in this space, and that would also be something that would be, in our view, worth digging into in more detail in a future session of the Glasgow dialogue. And so just to sum up for question 4, in our view, there's scope for improving the interplay between the different funding streams that exist for different aspects along the spectrum of loss and damage. We need to improve the complementarity of those funding instruments. And of course, resources need to be scaled up in all these channels. So it's not to say that there's enough resources across all of them. We know the humanitarian system is stretched too. The development financing needs are very considerable, as are the climate needs going forward. So it's about, in our view, making a much better interplay of this whole architecture that we have there, and to dig a bit deeper into some of these issues. Thank you, Mr. Kofslayer. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Switzerland. I think you're putting out your case, understanding the whole spectrum and how all this fits together for ultimately working towards a common purpose. But yeah, that we've had some challenge others challenging that, saying we need to zoom at the specific, but it's also, I think, in my view, important to understand the whole landscape for you to reach that particular point. So thanks for that. Mexico, you've got the floor.
Thank you, facilitator. Well, definitely we need to strengthen capacity building for finance access. In Mexico, we have some cooperation with Latin America to explain the way to request and access to GCF and GAF funding. So that is something that we can strengthen. And more if we can find a way to strengthen finance access to loss and damage. We also must to think about it. Hearing the experience of Palau, we need to have and push for loss and damage finance action with recovered perspective and prevent future pandemics, future challenges that are also related with the relationship with nature. I think that a lot of countries mention it also that we need to enhance loss and damage action with nature-based solutions, and we think that it's really necessary. We will just add nature-based solutions with focus on ecosystems approach. So that it's really important for Mexico too, because we have oceans, lands, forests, and even we think that cities need to have a specific action and responses. How can we improve it? Well, in Mexico we have a national risk atlas. We have the projection from 2015 to 2039, and it helps us to identify possible risk and try to address the problem in our national budget with our national ministries. It also shows the differential vulnerability of the municipalities or local communities with respect to different current and potential climate threats. So maybe we can share our experience with other countries on this and also explore opportunities to develop something similar with the most vulnerable countries, maybe with some support from WMO or universities that are drawing common to draw a common strategy to prevent, avert, and minimize all losses and damage. And we totally support Switzerland about the importance to discuss more about the difference between adaptation, loss and damage. And I will add also to talk about the difference between reduction risk disasters. Thank you.
Thank you, Mexico, for reiterating the point of strengthening capacity to access funding, but also for drawing the linkage between loss and damage and nature-based solution approaches. We now go to South Africa, then, I don't know, Fiji, yes.
Thank you, Marcella. Two things. One is an observation, the other one is a gap that I'd like to flag. The observation is we've heard from Fiji, Vanuatu, Chile, Philippines, and even reference to the floods in South Africa, the devastating floods that we've had twice in a row. And a lot of these loss and damages are beyond projects. We are no longer in the area of projects. But then we've also heard really good examples of finances that's existing. But we heard yesterday during the presentations regarding the Adaptation Fund and the GCF, these sources need to be sought by the countries and it needs to be country driven. But we've also heard that often these needs a trigger, it needs an accreditation process, it needs a proposal, it needs to meet donor criteria, it needs to be assessed by the board. And my gap is, or the gap that I want to flag is, what if countries simply do not have the capacity to meet all these triggers, needs, assessments, criteria, and it's not due to a lack of not wanting to, but the capacity is simply not there. So we can design the best mechanism, but if the country is not in a position to activate whatever it is that we design, there's no assistance. Thank you.
Thank you, South Africa, for raising that very important question right at the end. We go to Fiji.
Thank you. So I want to raise what I think is a really central process issue that I think needs to be brought into the room. We've heard from colleagues that we want a process that is looking at innovative models in the future. We've heard from a range of colleagues that we want a process that looks at climate finance gaps. We've heard from colleagues that we want a process that looks towards future financing solutions. But my question to you is, I don't think, how will the Glasgow dialogue deliver on any of these things? It has no reporting requirements, it has no clear timeframes, it has no deliverables attached to it. It wasn't designed through any kind of consultative process, it wasn't designed in consultation with parties. And I think there are these foundational flaws at the heart of what the Glasgow dialogue is. So I strongly request that we rethink the nature of this dialogue, that we start to actually articulate a pathway to address what we can hear in the room are a set of urgent concerns, and that we work together to think around these areas of innovation, these critical financial needs. I think the foundational underpinnings of what this dialogue need to be strengthened considerably for it to have meaning and purpose, fit for purpose for what it needs to be to go forward. And I think in its present form, it is going to be extremely frustrating to parties. So I just want to bring that comment to the floor.
Thank you, Fiji, for raising that process or those process issues, and will most certainly bring them to the attention of the SBI chair. But I believe that you'll have a chance also to still raise them. I'm going to indicate the slot that has been scheduled for this. The last speaker for the day is European Union.
Thanks. I'll keep it quite brief. Just to acknowledge that while we believe that the existing means of delivering adaptation, mitigation and disaster response and recovery have already contributed substantially to averting, minimising and addressing loss and damage, we also believe, and it is clear from today, that there is more needed to be done to bolster coordination among the approaches, to improve coordination with these activities, and also to look at inefficiencies and where things are not sufficient. Thanks to, at the same time, we must ensure that the support architecture for addressing, minimising and averting, minimising and addressing loss and damage is flexible and fit for the diversity of challenges faced by the different vulnerable countries. And I think today we got quite a rich overview of some of these innovations that have been trialled and in some cases have been scaled up. I would support the suggestion from Switzerland that maybe we need to look at the structure in terms of deep dives on some of these issues that are coming up again and again, such as slow onset events and also non-economic loss and damage. That could be very interesting. And also just one final acknowledgement of the good point that was raised by our colleague from South Africa in terms of ensuring that there aren't barriers to accessing finance where agile and quick finance is needed. And I think that's one of the areas where we think that the humanitarian donors could share a lot in terms of experience and systems of what works well there, because that's a system that has been set up to have quick flows, agile responses, minimal kind of application processes so that the funding can flow quite quickly. So there are opportunities for learning and application there as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, European Union, and at this point in time, there are no more flags, and indeed we sort of have used the time allocated to us. But I must confess that this has been a very useful dialogue. I mean, there were rich discussions here, a lot of lessons learned in this, but also serious challenges put on the table and serious constraints, serious limitations, and clear solutions. I also understand the deep dive that are still needed in some of the areas. But I believe that there were indications for a need for immediate action in some of these things. Some of the issues that were raised here do not really need some further deep dives. They really need some solutions. We need to find a solution as soon as possible. I believe the room can agree to that based on some of the serious challenges that we had and the serious innovations that are out there. And addressing some of these barriers such as access, the time it takes to develop a project, and eventually getting financial resources. Those things, I believe, need serious attentions, but also building our own capacity in terms of the linkages that are out there. But from my summary, I can clearly understand that there's a pressing need to address some of these gaps that are there, that everyone agrees, and nobody's questioning that the science is there, the innovations are there, some financing is there, but it's not enough. Where do we go from here? The dialogue is rich. We need more dialogue because there's more interesting things to talk about. We need to drill down deep down into some of the issues, but there's pressing issues that needs to be done at this point in time. So we will bring all these discussions, we'll summarize all these discussions and bring them to the attention of the SBI chair, who will then give further guidance in terms of how to proceed. For now, I just want to thank you for your participation and engaging in this discussion, and just to remind you that that the first Glasgow dialogue will resume in plenary on Saturday, the 11th, between 11 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon in Chamber Halls. So thank you very much for that. EU, is that a new flag or is okay. All right, thank you. And the meeting, this is where we stop. Thank you, thank you, thank you.